Okay, we're on Yudalit Amid Aleph, 3 lines from the bottom. It's 14a3, the last paragraph in the second column. Tanarabanan, Ezo Almanas Isa. So the word Isa normally means dough, like you make a dough for bread. But Almanas Isa, we're going to say, is a woman who's, we're not sure what status her husband had. Ezo Almanas Isa. What is a widow of an Isa? That in Edios we saw last week from Mishnah Edios that she's allowed to marry a Kohen. Because remember, if she gets married to someone who she's not allowed to be married to, in most cases she would become a halala or a zona, I should say. Because it's not just that. In some cases, just the problem that the kid becomes has a psul, but sometimes the woman also gets a psul. So kol she'ein ba lo mishum mamzeres v'lo mishum nesinos v'lo mishum avdei malachin. So anyone who's not, there's no suspicion of being a mamzer, so someone who is born from incest or adultery that would make someone a mamzer, and not from a nasin. So according to most likely thing, nasin was a group of people who converted in the time of Yoshua, but they didn't convert with good motives, and they didn't keep halachos well, so they're suspected of being mamzerim. V'lo mishum avdei malachim, and not servants of kings. So, what do you mean servants of kings? Because in the Rashi says in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, Shlomo was so rich that people who were close to him were also rich and had high prestige. But some people were only were slaves, were not even Jewish, but pretend, in the time they would masquerade, or to certain people they would masquerade as being Jewish, so people thought they were Jewish. Or King Herod. King Herod his father was a slave to the Hashmonaim, and then he killed out most of the Hashmonaim and married someone from the family, and then he claimed that he was a Hashmonai, but really he wasn't. So there are cases like that where certain people were able to use proximity to the king and some wealth and power to pretend that they're Jewish, and they really weren't. King Herod?
No, what you just said, the knowledge of that.
Rashi says it.
Oh.
Rashi says it. But I mean, the Gemara talks about King Herod at the beginning of Bava Basra and Daf Gimel, and I think a little bit also in the end of Kedushin. So King Herod's father, in Tosos in a few places, I think also in Gittin, but King Herod's father was a slave of the Hashmonaim. But then with the different political turmoils, and no, he was a slave. He was a slave.
Okay.
But then Herod was masquerading that he was Jewish, since he is close to the family, and then he married one of the daughters of one of the Hashmonaim people. So he claimed that he was, the continuation of the Hashmonaim dynasty.
Yeah, I thought it was well established that he was Jewish.
Not according to halacha.
Okay.
Because he was a slave and his father was never freed. So Tosos discusses in regard to Yush, there's the point of giving up hope of them having the ability to reclaim their possession, because as a slave.
Disagreements on that?
In halacha, no.
Okay.
The Gemara clearly says whoever says they're from the Hashmonaim family, they're really slaves, because either they were killed out or they were descendants from Herod.
Jewish slaves?
No, so they were non-Jewish slaves. Yeah, Canaanite. Yeah, Eved Kanani, not Jewish. If someone is a Jewish slave, like we're going to read about next week in Parshas Mishpatim, they're fully Jewish. But when we talk about an Eved like that, that means someone who's not Jewish. Herod wasn't a mamzer, but his kids. But when so it gets into a stronger thing. So let's say the halacha is that you need the mother to be Jewish, but you get your shevet, what tribe you're from the father. But what if in the case where the father doesn't have a tribe, such as if the father is not Jewish? So in that case, when a non-Jew would have relations with the Jewish woman, she would get the status of a zona, but her kid would be Jewish. But if a daughter wouldn't be allowed to marry a Kohen. If it's an Eved, Rav Aaron's father had a certain proof, which makes a lot of sense, is saying that an Eved is nothing, and the kid would be a Jew without so. But again, the daughter wouldn't be allowed to marry a Kohen. So what are you saying here? You're quoting from note 25. So there, yeah. So there is. Okay, so yeah, so we paskin that if a slave is the father and the mother is Jewish, so the slave doesn't have any yichus, any pedigree to pass on to the kid. So the kid is not a slave; it would just be regular Jew. There is an opinion that the kid is a mamzer. We don't paskin that way. So from the fact of this uh, of Avdei Malachim, so it also would fit well with with what Ron's father said. So because the father would be a slave, it doesn't have any negative. So sometimes, if let's say someone himself is a challah, his mother was divorced, married to a Kohen, or his father was already a challah, so they pass on that problem we might call that negative yichus, a problem. But if there's an Eved doesn't have any yichus according to halacha, so an Eved can't pass on anything negative to his kid. So if the mother would be a slave, then the kids would be a slave just like her. So the halacha is, let's say, an Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave. We're going to read about a Parshas Mishpatim. He is allowed, the master is allowed to give him a non-Jewish slave. You have to understand according to halacha how would be why it's allowed. Because just because he's an Eved Ivri doesn't mean that the mitzvos don't apply to him. He has to do all the mitzvos. But for whatever reason, he's allowed to have a non-Jewish slave, and then if she would have kids, they would be slaves just like her, not Jewish, and be owned by the master. The same master of the Jewish Eved is the master of the non-Jewish slave, woman slave. So, but in the case of, let's say, a slave with a Jewish woman, the way we pass in, the slave has no yichus, so he doesn't have any negative yichus to give along to the kids. But however, it is possible that he might make the woman unfit to marry a Kohen, so the daughter might not be allowed to marry a Kohen. But there's an opinion we don't pass in like that. Well, there's different opinions in machlokas Tanaim. We don't pass in like Rabbi Akiva. We pass in that a mamzer would come from either adultery. If there's a misas based in or kares, a punishment for that relationship, then the kid is a mamzer. There is one opinion that any lav, if you violate any negative commandment, the kid would be a mamzer. We don't pass in that way. So, because a mamzer is a mamzer, a nasan is like a rabbinic mamzer, and Abdei Malachim, he's saying if there would be the kid of a kid would be a son of an Eved would be a mamzer. So that's why that footnote, it makes a lot of sense what that footnote says. So these are cases where you're worried, was this lady married to someone who might have been a mamzer, who was a mamzer? So these three categories are people that might have been a mamzer. So we say no, we are sure that they had none of these three family connections. Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, Shamati kol she'ein ba echad mikol elu masiyan lekahuna. I have heard who does not have any of these are allowed to marry a Kohen. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, and then a third opinion, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Mishum Rabbi Meir, in the name of Rabbi Meir, even though we just had a statement from Rabbi Meir, so he heard something slightly different from Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh Omer Kidvarav, and similarly, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh said like this: Ezo Yamanas Isa, who is an Almanas Isa? Kol shenitma ba safek chala. If within her there is a doubt of being chala. So a chalal is someone whose parents or grandparents or great grandparents, let's say a divorced woman married a Kohen, so he's a chalal, and he gives that chalalas to all of his kids. And the reason is the Jews know who's a mamzer, but they don't know who's a chalal. So if someone has potential halalos, that's something that is not well known. But if there's any question of mamzeres, people know who mamzerim are, so they'd stay away from them and not marry into their families. So chalal is probably like the word chol, like weekday. So remember, chol moed is the weekday like days of the moed. So a chalal, so we sometimes translate it as profane. For example, chil Hashem is profaning God's name. But a regular chol, like we say in Havdalah, Hamalda Mikodesh L'chol, chol isn't profane. Chol is an absence of sanctity. And in regard to Chol HaMoed, it has less sanctity than the Yantif days, but it still has more than a regular day. So a Chalal is someone who lost the special status of Kahuna. That's how I would translate it. Someone who lost the special status of Kahuna. What? Chalav. Oh, halal is Arabic kosher. I don't know what the word means in Arabic, but it's not a positive connotation in Hebrew, and in Arabic it seems to have some special status. So my guess is it's not related to the Arabic word, but actually the Arabic word for treif is haram, and haram is similar to a cherem. Now, we normally think of cherem as an excommunication, but in the Chumash, a cherem is something that no one was allowed to have benefit from. Like Sichon and Og, they were machrim, they made the cities of Sichon and Og into a cherem, which meant it was dedicated to Hashem, or actually, that was completely destroyed. No one was allowed to have benefit. So haram, I think, is similar to cherem in Chumash, but halal, I don't know what it means. So Amar Mar. So let's analyze the brisa that we just said. Anyone that her husband did not have any suspicion of being a mamzer or a nasin or a slave of a king, which also would have been, according to that opinion, a mamzer. So the implication is ha halal kasher. That implies that if there'd be a halal, she is kshera and she'd be allowed to marry a kohen. But the question is, Maishna Hanaf Diraisa, Chalanami Diraisa. So what's the difference if her husband would have been a halal versus being a mamzer nasin or avdei malachim? Just like those are not allowed to marry into a kohen or even any Jew Diraisa, a halal also is a Torah law. It's in Parshas Emor. Isha grusham isha lo yikachu v'isha zonav halal lo yikachu v'isha grusham isha lo yikachu in the beginning of Parshas Emor. So why is it less worried about a halal than about being a mamzer nasin or avdei malachim? V'su Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said, "Shamati kol she'ein ba'achad mikol ela masin l'kuhuna." I heard that one who doesn't have any of these is allowed to marry a kohen. Hainu Tanakama, but that's the exact same opinion as the Tanakama. If we look back on the previous Amud, the Brisa started, who is an Almanas Isa? Whoever does not have no doubt of mamzer, no doubt of being a nasin, and not mishum and not being an Evan Malachin. And then Rabbi Meir says, I heard someone who doesn't have any of these is allowed to. What's he arguing? He's saying the same thing. So why would the Brisa ascribe a second opinion in the Brisa to the opinion of Rabbi Meir if he's saying the same thing as the Tanakama? We don't know the name of the Tanakama, but the first opinion in the Brisa. Besu, and another question, Rabbi Shimba ben Elazar and Mishum Rabbi Meir. The third opinion in the Brisa is a statement of Rabbi Shimba ben Elazar in the name of Rabbi Meir, and similarly, Rabbi Shimba ben Nasia also said the same thing. Ezo manas Isa, kol shenit mevasafik chalal, makir yisam mamzer shebeneim, makir chalal shebeneim. So he said the reason is because if that Amanas Isa is someone that there's a doubt that maybe her husband was a halal. So even though there's a doubt her husband was a halal, she's allowed to marry a kohen. Because again, she's a widow. Widows are allowed to marry kohanim, but we weren't sure if her husband had apostle status or not. So we're saying even if he was only a safek halal, that doesn't confer a status on her that would forbid her to marry a Kohen. But the Gemara asks, "V'hamar reisha chalal kasher." So the first opinion was that a halal is kosher, and now we're saying that she's only would be allowed to marry a Kohen if she was a suffix halal. So why is he being stricter than the original brisa? The original brisa implied that only the problem of mamzer, nasin, or avdei malachim would disqualify her from marrying a Kohen. But if it was a halal, it would be okay. And now he's saying, even if there's a doubt of halal, she is. So why wouldn't she be? If originally we said that if he was a halal, it would be allowed to marry a Kohen. So Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Mamzer tzoveach v'chalal shosek ika benayu." The machlokas is if you have a mamzer who is screaming and a chalal who is quiet. That's the difference. So what does this mean? Tanakama savar kol psul dekarole b'shosek pasul. The Tanakama holds if someone would call someone else a mamzer, and the person who was just called a mamzer doesn't start screaming and say, "Don't call me mamzer, I'm not a mamzer." So if he argues on it, then he's not a mamzer. There's actually a different Gemara that says if you get mad at someone and call them a mamzer, it's because you're a mamzer. That the Gemara says in that of Kedusha. But here it's saying if someone called you a mamzer and you're not, you should vehemently argue. So if someone was called a mamzer and he didn't vehemently argue, that's a tacit admission that he is a mamzer. So the Tanakama holds that if someone called you the name of a puzzle person and you were quiet, that admission, you wasn't an active admission, but the quiet, tacit admission is an admission that you are puzzled. V'hachi kamer Tanakama, and this is what the first opinion in the Bryce is saying. Ezu almanasisa, which woman has the status of almanasisa who's allowed to marry a Kohen? Someone who, if someone would call her a mamzer, they would be quiet, because if they would be quiet, there would be a problem. Not if they would call her a nasan and be quiet. Not if they'd say you're a descendant of, Shmerel, Herod, whatever, who was Avdei Malachim, or if they'd call you a chalal and also be quiet. The Kamerle Rabbi Meir, Hanachu de Kapasol Lebekal. So Rabbi Meir disagrees with the Tanakama. He says, Mamzer Nasan and Avdei Malachim, you're not allowed to marry a kosher Jew at all. So if they're quiet for that, I agree with you. Aval shtuk chalal kosher. But if someone would call someone else a chalal, and the person who had just been called a chalal doesn't argue and doesn't yell and scream at him, that's not a problem. That's not an admission by which we will confirm our suspicion of him being a chalal. The fact that he doesn't scream is because it doesn't matter. He could still marry kosher Jews. A mamzer is not allowed to marry a kosher Jew. A chalal is allowed to marry a kosher Jew. Just a female chalal is not allowed to marry a Kohen. But other than that, you can marry a kosher Jew. The Kamerle Rabbi Shimon Elazar Tanakama de Rabbi Meir. And then Rabbi Shimon Elazar said to the Tanakama who argues on Rabbi Meir, if you know that Rabbi Meir held his halacha even when the person is quiet, meaning they don't argue when you call them a mamzer or a halal, isn't that where you called him a halal and he was quiet? It's when you called him a mamzer and he was quiet. And the reason he's quiet is because there is some type of, a call is there's like rumors. It's a little different than rumors, but it's somewhat known in the community, but it's not exactly out there. But it's known that this person is a mamzer. So if there is no rumor about it, people aren't going to heed any attention to the fact that he was called a mamzer. Avon mamzer v'tzoveach, but when someone's called a mamzer and he screams and protests about being called a mamzer, or chalal v'shosei pasal, or if he's a chalal and he's quiet, in that case he's pasal. V'hayde ishtik savar mistaye de lamapki lemikal, and the reason he's quiet is because as a chalal he could still marry a kosher woman, so he has no reason to protest. But the earlier thing about mamzer v'tzoveach, according to Rabbi Meir, a mamzer who is screaming, he would be puzzle, because Rabbi Meir seems to hold that there is some type of knowledge within the community who's a mamzer, so it doesn't matter if he responds. Well, it's not quite what it says right here. He's saying, so according to the Tanakama, if he's quiet, let me just say here. Right, so Rabbi Yochanan is saying, according to the Tanakama, if they call you a mamzer and you're quiet, you're puzzle. According to Rabbi Meir, if you're a mamzer and you're quiet, excuse me, said that wrong. According to Rabbi Yochanan says, according to the Tanakama, if they call you a mamzer and you're quiet, that's a problem. And Rabbi Meir says that chalal is different, and Rabbi Yochanan has the first case holds even chalal. Rabbi Meir says no. If it's a chalal and quiet, isn't any problem, because a chalal could still marry a kosher Jew. So that's not a problem. And then the third opinion in the Brisa is saying Rabbi Yochanan holds that if you're a chalal and you're quiet, you're kosher. Excuse me. The only time when Rabbi Meir says you're kosher and you're quiet is when you're a mamzer and you're quiet, and when someone calls you a mamzer and you're quiet. And the reason you're quiet is because I don't have to defend myself. The community has the knowledge of who's a mamzer, so I don't have to say anything about it because the community knows I'm not a mamzer. But in a case where the mamzer is screaming or a chalal and is quiet, then you're puzzle. And the reason is that this chalal was quiet because, again, he felt that there was no need to defend himself because he could still marry a kosher Jew even if he's a chalal. Okay. Tanichada. So one brisa said, Rabbi Yossi Amar Stuk Mamzer Kosher. If someone was called a mamzer and he was quiet, he didn't argue about it, he's kosher to marry a regular Jew, a kosher Jew. Stuk Chala Pasal. But someone who was called Chala and is quiet is not allowed to marry a kosher Jew. Or is not allowed to marry into a Kohen family. The Tanya Idach, when I say Kohen family, that the female Chalala couldn't marry, so this Chalal's daughter would not be allowed to marry a Kohen. He's allowed to marry a Bas Kohen. There's no problem with that. But another brisa talks Shtuk Chalal Kosher. If someone's called a Chalal and they responded in silence, they are kosher, and Shtuk Mamzer Pasal. If you were called a Mamzer and you were quiet, then you're considered a mamzer, you're not allowed to marry a kosher Jew. So there's a contradiction in the brises. So how can we reconcile the brises? Lo kasha. Ha Tanakama libid Rabbi Meir. So the second one that says shtuk chalal kosher and shtuk mamzer pasal is according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Had Rabbi Shimon Elazar libid Rabbi Meir. And the first brise was Rabbi Shimon about an Elazar according to Rabbi Meir. That the Jews recognize mamzerim, so a mamzer doesn't have to defend himself. But a chalal should defend himself. And the only reason he doesn't defend himself is because he's admitting he's a chalal. He knows he's a chalal, but it's not a big deal because he can still marry a regular Jewish woman. Okay, Mishnah, the bottom of Yudala Amud Beis. Now we'll see. I don't know if this is going to be connected. Hopefully we're going to get to the end of the first perek today, and we're going to see that the beginning of the Mishnah, the first Mishnah of the second perek, talks about a pesha asur, a pesha hiter. Can you say something? Well, it's kind of connected to actually what we spoke about, started talking about 2 weeks ago. If the woman makes a certain claim, when do we believe her claim? I mean, we were talking about the case where she wasn't a virgin, and she agrees she's not a virgin, but she said it was because she injured herself. She bumped up against protruding rock or a tree stump that had been, a tree had been cut and there was a stump there. So he said the fact that she could have said that she didn't deny it completely gives some validity to her claim. That we said was Rabbi Gamliel's opinion. But in other cases, there's in the case of pesha aser who pesha hiter. if someone comes and says, I'm a Kohen, we don't know who he is. We don't know. We never met him before he came. He says, oh, I came from New York, or I came from California, whatever, and I'm a Kohen. So you can give him the Kohen Aliyah. It's not a problem. Then he wants to marry a Grusha, a divorced woman. You say, no, you're not allowed to. You told us you're a Kohen. So even if you're wrong, because you told it, by you saying that you're a Kohen, you have now forbidden upon yourselves all the laws that are forbidden, the things that a Kohen is forbidden to do. So that's the principle called a pesha aser, pesha aser. So I mean, in this case, so the person didn't say anything, but it's a reaction. So it's so the case of the person coming and saying, I'm a Kohen, that's everything we know is from him. What we were talking about before, the woman, the husband was saying that she wasn't a virgin, and she's responding to that. And this halacha is, again, someone called Shmuel a mamzer, and mamzer, and then Shmuel starts yelling at him, no, I'm not, how dare you call me that? So that's, again, a reaction. So pesha aser is a little different because it's not a reaction, it's an initial statement. Okay, Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi, Ma'isa b'tinoka shiyorda l'malos ma'mina ein benensa. There was an incident where a young a girl went to fill up the water by the well. Benensa, and she was raped. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So the question is, if she was raped by a kosher Jew, obviously it's a person did an avera, but she could still marry a Kohen, when it's time for her to get married. But maybe she was raped by a goy, or by an aved, or by someone who was of bad yichus, or a mamzer maybe, in which case she wouldn't be allowed to marry a Kohen. So what's the status of her? We don't know who the attacker was. If the majority of people in that city were allowed to marry, Kohanim were allowed to marry, their sisters or their daughters, so then we say that the person who attacked her was someone who was of kosher lineage, and therefore she remains kosher, and she's allowed to marry a Kohen. Okay, so Gemara says, Amar le Rav Rav Nachman, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri to Amar Kaman. Whose opinion does Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri hold? Rabbi Gamliel feel brov psulanami makir. If you take Rabbi Gamliel, who we dealt with last week and the week before, Rabbi Gamliel says that even if the majority of people are puzzle, we assume that she was that she had become pregnant or whatever. In this case, it's just that she had been attacked by someone who was kosher. You don't need to have the majority of people being kosher people. And Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua holds, even if the majority of people would have all been kosher people from families of known yichos who would be allowed to marry a Kohen, she still remains puzzle. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri seems to hold like neither Rabbi Gamliel or like Rabbi Yeshua. Now, I mean, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was a Tana. Maybe he has a third opinion, but I guess if he would have had a third opinion, it would have had to be mentioned in one of those previous Mishnayos. So Amar Le, so Rav Nachman replied to Rava, Hachi Am Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. This is how Rabbi Yehuda Amarav explained this as we turn to Tesvav Lavan Aleph. Bikrono shel Tzipora hayama'isach Rabbi Ami. This was a case where there was some type of fair in Tzipori, and according to what Rabbi Ami says, the Amar Rabbi Ami says, there was a caravan of kosher people from out of town who came to Tzipori to buy stuff at this fair or whatever was going on there. Uchad Rabbi Yanai, and it also follows what Rabbi Yanai says, the Am Rabbi Yanai nivelas b'kronos kshera l'kuhuna. If she had been, now the word nivelas is less than raped, but if she had cohabited with someone where, like, let's say the parking lot, the Kronos, she's ksher lekahuna. She remains kosher to marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says, "Bikronos akadaitach." What do you mean that in the caravans? Ella nivelas b'shak Kronos ksher lekahuna. That's talking about a case where it was in a time where these people from out of town who were also kosher people, that's when they were in Tzipori. Aval pirush achan mitzipori uval havlad shtuki. But if it were a case where someone from Tzipori, and this person obviously left the other people to go with this to take this young woman, Ubal Havlat Shtuki. In that case, the blood is a Shtuki. Shtuki is where we don't know who the father is. Do you say the kid, who's your father? And they say, they to try to shush him. So in that case, we don't know who the father is, and that's not a good case of yichus. So basically, we're saying is that according to Rabbi Gamliel, if everyone in Tzipori was kosher, you didn't need to have the time of according to Rabbi Gamliel, if everyone in Tzipori was kosher, or the majority of people in Tzipori were kosher, she'd be allowed to marry a Kohen. But the reason that he says that in this case is because the situation happened. This halacha was said in regard to a very specific situation, and in that situation, the people in Tzipori were Rov Ksherim, and also there were other people from out of town who were visiting Tzipori, and they were also Rov Ksherim. So even though we don't normally need two reasons that it would be kosher, here we have two populations that combine to form a superpopulation, and in that case, it's kosher, which would imply that if you wouldn't have had this double kosher population, she wouldn't have been kosher. So the Gemara is going to ask this soon. Kiha, the Chiasa, Rav Dimi, Amar Zeiri, Amar Chanina, this is similar to when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael. He said the name of Zeiri, who said the name of Rav Chanina. Va'amrile Amar Zeiri, Amar Rav Chanina, and some said it was that Zeiri said the name of Rav Chanina. It wasn't, Rav Dimi wasn't involved. Holchen Acharov Ha'er, Ve'en Holchen Acharov Sia. We follow the majority of the city, but we don't follow the majority of the caravan, of the people who come from out of town. So, Klap Elaya, that doesn't make sense. It should be the opposite. Because Hanai, the Hakvi V'kaimi. Because the people who had come from out of town in the caravan, they are mobile. They have come from wherever they came and now are in this place. Vahani Kvi V'kaimi. But the people who already live in Tzipori or whatever town we're talking about, they are set. And we'll see what it means in a couple lines about being set. So meaning if the people, so from here it seems to be saying if they're moving, maybe they moved out already, and maybe they had nothing to do with this, with what happened to this girl. But the people who live there, they're more likely to have something to do with that. I mean, obviously, you can make an opposite argument also. If you want to do a crime, you go to an unfamiliar place where people would recognize you. But Ella, so what did Reb Chanina must have meant? Hochen acharova ir. We follow the majority of the city. But that's only when there's also a majority of the visiting people together with the rova ir that they're also kosher. Vein hochen acharova ir grade sa, velo acharov sia grade sa. But we wouldn't follow the majority of the city by itself, or just the majority of the caravan, the visiting people by themselves. So Lahavdil, I'm sure Marty, you heard of the group of Illini fans who they traveled to they were a game and they were going to go to Iowa, and then Iowa rescinded their tickets. So in that case, you have a caravan of traveling people. So in the Gemara, Lahavdil is talking about a case of Jews from a different city who came to this city because, I don't know, there was, right now at Yeshiva University, there's this farm sale. So people come from all over to get farm meal. It's a great collection and a selection of farm, and they have very good prices. And I sent Rabbi Eugene books over there, so hopefully people over there will be able to buy them there. So here we would need the two majorities, that the majority of the city is kosher and the majority of the traveling people. But if, let's say, you only had one of the majorities, we wouldn't allow her to marry a Kohen. So let's say, what would this be? Let's say you're at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, and then a caravan from people who are going to this farm sale come to that rest stop. So the only people around are from that caravan, but that's only one group of people. So we need to have a place where the city is kosher people, and then more people come from outside and they're also kosher. Now, why do we need that? Why do we need that? My time. What's the reason that we need two majorities? The people who are here at the beginning are kosher, and we have an influx of more kosher people. There was a decree that you need the majority of the travelers also have to be kosher, because we might only have relied on the majority of the city, and we are not allowed to rely on just the majority of the city. If the majority of the city were kosher, we could not presume that this girl would be allowed to marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says, Verova Ernami. Well, what's wrong with the majority if the majority of the city were kosher Jews? What's the problem? Idika Asli in Hulagaba. If he went, so we're going to get to very important Yardea a topic right here. If he left wherever he was, meaning it's someone from the city, but he left his house and went to her, called the Parsh Meruba Parsh. The halacha is, if someone separates, he separates from the majority. So if the majority were kosher Jews and he separated from the majority, we could assume that he separated from the majority and he's kosher, just like the majority. So in this case, how come we wouldn't allow, if the whole city, if the majority of the city is kosher, and one of those men from the city went to and found this girl, we should assume that she was, the person who had relations with her was someone who's kosher to marry a Kohen, whose family was kosher to marry a Kohen. Their daughter, the women of their family could marry a Kohen. So why shouldn't she be allowed to marry a Kohen? So the Gemara says, because it's a case where he didn't leave the group. It's a case where he stayed. I don't want to use the word stationary, but we'll see in a few lines, it'll become a lot clearer. The Havile Kavua. So it's not where he went to her, but she went to him. Again, we're not talking about the criminality here, but we're saying that he didn't leave his place. Because when she would have gone to him, and that doesn't mean literally, but in a halachic way, the Havile Kavua, he is considered set. The ArtScroll says it's stationed, but Kavua is something like set. The calendar is set. The Kavia Diyarcha. Amr Abzera, and Abzera says Kol Kavua Kamechza Mechza Dami. Anything which is established or set, it's only a 50-50 chance. But do you still need two Reuben? We need the majority of the city to be kosher people, and we need the majority of the visitors to be kosher. But we learned in the Brisa. This is a very famous Brisa. If there's 9 kosher butcher shops and 1 treif butcher shop in the city, and you went into one of the stores and you don't remember which one you went into, what's halacha? Sveiko aser. If you have a doubt, you're not allowed to eat the meat, because since the stores are set, it's a 50-50 chance halachically. Uvenimtza, but what if you found a piece of meat? Haloch achararo, you're allowed to follow the majority. So when you went into a store, you went into one of the 10 established businesses. So those are set, they're kavua, and so it's only a 50-50 chance halachically that you went into the kosher one. So you're not allowed to eat the meat. But if it was on the street, it's separated from, it must have come from one of those 10 stores, but you're not in one of the 10 stores. You found it somewhere else. So you could assume that it came from the majority. And since 9 of the stores sell kosher meat, we could assume that this piece of meat is also kosher. So in that halacha, there's only one rove. There's 9 stores against 1. And in there, we say that you could follow the majority. So how come here, in this case, we needed 2 rubos? We needed the rove of the people in the community were kosher, and you needed the rove of the people traveling through the town were also kosher. So v'chitema b'shein dasos medina nu'ulos, and if you think that's only true where the doors, where the gates of that city are locked, so other people can't come into ka'isi le ruba me'alma. So then there's also a rove of kosher meat from outside the world. So maybe you're saying, oh, in the place where there's 9 kosher stores and 1 kosher store, there's also free trade, and the doors, the borders aren't locked. So kosher meat could have come in. Majority of the world was kosher meat and could have come in from there, and it is 2 rubos. You can't say that. Rab Zera says afapisha dalsos medina ulos. His halacha was if you found a piece of meat and the majority of stores were kosher stores, you could eat it. That's also if it was a very closed economy. You couldn't get any other meat. So 1 rove is enough. So how come for this young woman, we needed 2 rubos for her to be kosher to Kohen? So the Gemara answers, Maila also be Yuchsin. They made very strict in the case of Yichus, and they required two rubos. So even though Maker a din, you didn't need it. But the Kohanim were very strict upon themselves, and they require 2 majorities. Gufa, we had just learned. Amr B'Zera says, anything which is set is like 50-50 chance. Bein the kula, bein the chomer, whether it's going to be strict, whether it's going to be a leniency. So in our case, if there's 9 kosher butcher shops and 1 treif, and you didn't know which one you went into, we say it's 50-50, and that makes it strict. You're not allowed to eat the meat. That's a case of stringency. Okay, so there's 2 things. There's rove, a case of majority, and then there's chazaka. Chazaka would be, if we don't know what the thing is, we would follow status quo. But here, there is no status quo to follow because we know that you did something. You went into a store. So when we would use chazaka, that would be, we don't know, we didn't do an x-ray of this or an MRI of this cow. We don't know that it doesn't have any, we don't know that it doesn't have any deformities that would render it a treifa, a broken bone, or a needle stuck in its esophagus or in its stomach. So we could presume that, any random cow walking on the street is kosher, and therefore we could drink the milk. So, but when we shecht it, we do look for common problems. That's why the shochtim feel the lungs. But for it to have a brain abscess is a very, very unusual thing. So they don't have to check to make sure that there is no brain tumor. But lung diseases are common, so we have to check that. But the chazaka is, so there's no chazaka that the lungs are okay, but there's a chazaka that there's no problem, let's say, in the brain. So we don't need to cut open the head and check every brain. So Manale the Reb Zera, how did Reb Zera know this halacha? If it's from the halacha of the 9 stores, which we just said, where 9 are selling kosher meat and 1 is selling treif meat, and you don't know which one you borrowed from it, so the doubt says you're not allowed to eat the meat. However, if you found the meat in the street somewhere, you're allowed to follow the majority. Hasam l'chumra. That only tells us that we're allowed to follow the majority, that we follow that will be a case where it's strict, but not a leniency. But if there would be a kavua, what would be a case of kavua where it was set and it would lead to a leniency? So here we said you can't eat the meat. That's a stringency. Where would it lead to a leniency? So there's a case where you have 9 frogs and 1 sheretz. So a frog is slippery and a sheretz is also slippery, except the sheretz has a very high level of tuma and a frog doesn't. You touched one of the things. You don't know if you don't know if you touch the frog, in which case you're not tameh, or if you touch the sheretz and you are very tameh. So in that case, feiko tameh. Because of your doubt, we have to assume that you are tameh. But hasamnami l'chumra, that's also a case of astringency. Because we're not sure, we have to assume you're tameh. What's a source where the doubt will allow you to be lenient? So so if you had 9 shratzim and then 1 frog, and you don't know which one you touch, if you're in a private domain, the doubt is tameh. In but if you're in a public area, the doubt is tahor. There's a general rule that if you're tahor or tameh, that if you're in a public area, you're pure, you're tahor, but if you're in a private area, you're tameh. So here we see a case where we trust this. Where the kol kavua ends up making you a safek. So really, it's a 50-50 if you touched a sheretz or you touched a frog. But there's a separate principle that when there's a doubt of if you're tummy or not, if you're in a public area, you're tahor. So if you couple the kol kavua, it was set that there was 9 shratzim and 1 frog. So the odds are only 10% that you touched the frog. But by it being kavua, it made it 50-50. So that doesn't make you tahor. But then when it's in a public place and it's the 50-50, the fact that you're in a public place says it's 51% that you didn't touch the frog. Excuse me, that you didn't touch the sheretz. Even though the 90% are shratzim, the halacha of kavua, that because the numbers were set, we end up giving a leniency and you are not tamei. Even though the probability is that you're tamei, the halacha is that you're not tamei. You're not tamei because that. So we could be lenient in the case of kavua when the numbers were set, even though they were majority tamei, you're going to be not tamei. So what's the source from the Torah that we can rely on this? Amar krava arav lo v'kam alav. There's a case where someone laid an ambush and attacked someone and killed him. So the Gemara says, so how come it had to say he laid an ambush and killed him? If you killed someone, you get punished for murder. Why does it have to be an ambush? Achis chavin lo. So the Gemara makes a drasha. You laid an ambush because you were specifically waiting for a specific person. But according to this opinion, if you were waiting in ambush, you wanted to kill Chaim Pipik, and instead you killed Beryl, then you wouldn't be chayav. Even though you didn't act of murder, but because you'd only be chayav when the act of murder was the act of murder that you planned. According to that, a random act of violence would not be prosecutable. I think we found some things for Kim Fox to use in a re-election campaign. Just kidding. Rabbanan, and so the Rabbanan who argue with Rabbi Shimon, this opinion was Rabbi Shimon, they hold you don't have to kill the person that you were intending to. How come it says that you laid an ambush? Amri Devei Rav Yanai, the yeshiva of Rav Yanai answered, Prak Lazark Evan Laga. That excludes a case where you threw a stone into a group of Jews and non-Jews, and you would be chayiv misa if you killed a Jew. You wouldn't be chayiv misa when you killed a non-Jew. So according to the Chachamim, you would not be chayiv misa in that case. So you don't have to have intent to kill a specific person, but as long as you kill someone in the category of whom you would get the death penalty. No, it's not mutter to kill a non-Jew. That's not what the Gemara is saying. It's also to kill a non-Jew, but you wouldn't get the death penalty for it. So hechidami. So what's the case of throwing the stone into a group? If there were 9 Canaanites and 1 Yisrael, why don't we say that you don't get killed because the majority, you don't get killed meaning as a punishment because the majority of Canaanim, and you're not chayav misa for killing a Canaani. Inami, or the case is Palga, there was a group, there were 5 Jews and 5 Canaanim, and you threw the stone and killed someone. Safek nefashos lahakel. There's a general rule that when there's a doubt of this in regard to a life, we're lenient. So in this case, it's 50-50 if you killed a Jew, but it was only a 50% chance of killing a Jew. So when it's safek, 50% is there's no more safek than that. The halacha is that we are lenient to save a life. So in order to save this person's life from the death penalty, we'll go for leniency. So we can't. So this case, the fact that you threw it into the group and you don't get the death penalty isn't enough of a proof from the Chumash that we rely on this. So lo tzricha deikatisha Yisraelim Knani echad b'neihem. No, so we're talking about a case where there were 9 Jews in the group and one Knani, and you threw it into the group and you killed someone. The Havale Knani kavua. So even though the majority was Jews, it's because the numbers were set, it becomes a thing of kavua being set. So since even though he's only 1, but that 1 Kanani is considered set, so when something happens to a set situation, it's considered 50-50 halachically. So that's where we could see this idea of kol kavua kamach samach tzadami from a pasuk. Itmar. So on 3 lines up from the bottom on Tesvav Amud Aleph, 15a5, second column. Itma Rav Chia bar Ashi Amarav. Rav Chia bar Ashi, send the name of Rav. Halacha Rabbi Yossi. We follow like Rabbi Yossi that we don't need the 2 rubos because our Mishnah, the first opinion was Rabbi Yossi says, or he actually quoted Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, who passed like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that we need that you only need 1 rov. The Gemara explained to answer some questions that there were 2 rubos. But but here the Gemara is assuming the Gemara didn't explicitly say 2 rubos, so we're just assuming 1 rov. For Rav Chana, Chana bar Rav, Amar Rav Harasha Haisa. Rav Chana said the name of Rav and the name of Rav that we don't pass like that. That was only for that specific case. But you can't. But normally we would be more machmer than that. We would be more strict. We wouldn't allow her to marry a Kohen with only 1 rov. So must Rav Yirmiyah asked, we don't need 2 rovs, 2 majorities for a case of Yochsin, but we learned in a Raisa, as we turn the page here. This is quoted in Gemara Yuma and a Mishnah in Machshir and Matzah Batinok Mushlach. So let's say you found an abandoned kid, a little baby in the street, abandoned. So is it a Jewish kid or is it a non-Jewish kid? If the majority of people in the city are idol worshippers, we say that the kid is an idol worshiper. Yisrael. If the majority are Jews in this town, we say that he's also a Jew. Yisrael. If it's 50-50, we hold that he's a Jew. Va'amar Rav, and Rav says, Lo shanu elach yoso. That halacha was only telling us that we have to take care of him and feed him. Now, we don't have a mitzvah to take care of pagans who are idol worshippers. Regular goyim who are not idol worshippers, we do have to. We're not allowed to be cruel to them. So Rav says this isn't lo shanu elach yoso. This only said we treat him like a Jew, that we have to feed him and clothe him and raise him. Avol liyuchsin lo. But in regard to make him a kosher Jew that can marry anyone, we're not sure that he's a Jew unless we could figure out if he's a Jew. Shmuel Amar, but Shmuel argued on Rav, and Shmuel said if, let's say, in Turkey right now, in Syria, the earthquake. So that's what this Gemara is talking about. If a pile of stones, a building collapsed over a person, are we supposed to, try? Is there an obligation to get? So it's a great exertion to try to move all the rubble to save the kid. So in this case, this means that you're allowed to be Machal Shabbos to save the kid. So Shmuel says, yes, we treat the kid as Jewish, even to be Machal Shabbos to save him, but in a case where the building collapsed on him. So the problem is, Rav says that we don't, that just because the majority of the people are Jewish, we don't treat him as Jewish. So that statement is against our Mishnah, where Rabbi Yossi Haglili paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Because according to the way our Mishnah says, it just seems that there's 1 majority. So according to Rav, there was 1 majority. The majority are Jews, so we should let him marry a Jewish person also. So ishtamte hada amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav. So they had forgotten that how the Gemara explained the Mishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rabbi. The Mishnah was talking about where it was a specific incident in Tzipori when there were people coming from out of town to buy stuff there. So there were 2 majorities there. That's why Rav could say that. The whole reason he asked the question is because he read the Mishnah literally and he forgot that the Mishnah was not talking about the case that it literally sounded like. It was a case where there were 2 rubos. So according to Rav Chana bar Rava, who said that this was only a temporary ruling, Kashaha, how come it was only a temporary ruling? What's wrong? There's 2 rubos. Why could she marry a Kohen in general cases? How come Rav Yochanan said that we're not allowed to rely on Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's psak? Ma demasniha lamasniha. So the answer is, if you hold like Rav Chanan bar Abba that was Harasha, you held the case was literal. If you held like Rabbi Yehuda Marav that that it was the people. If there were two rubos, he wouldn't say harasha. Those two statements are incompatible. Okay, so let's a few more minutes. Let's try to finish up to the Mishnah, finish the perek. Gufa. So we had just saw a brisa or a Mishnah that said Matzabatinik mushlach in rov of tekhavim over kochavim in rov Yisrael Yisrael mechzamatzu Yisrael. So if you found a city, an abandoned kid in the city, if the majority of the townspeople are idol worshippers, we treat the baby as an idol worshiper. If the majority are Jews, we treat the baby as a Jew. If it's 50-50 Jews and non-Jews, we treat him as a good Jew. And Amar Rav Loshon Elachio. So Rav says this is only in regard to keeping the kid alive and raising him. We give him food, we give him clothes, we give him education. But we don't treat him like a Jew that he can marry any kosher Jew that he wants. So Shmuel Amar Lefakech Lavasagal, but Shmuel says we treat him like a Jew that we're even allowed to be Machal Shabbos to save him in case the building collapsed on him. Amar Shmuel Hachi. So the Gemara, so that's the statement that we just had. So the Gemara asks, Amar Shmuel Hachi, did Shmuel really say this, that we could rely on the rove of the people being Jewish, that this kid is Jewish, that we would even be Machal Shabbos for him? Nowadays, I guess it's important to mention, Jewish doctors are Machal Shabbos even for non-Jewish patients, and the main reason is Ava would cause unnecessary strife towards Jews if we wouldn't do that. Now, I believe that even though it's mutter, I believe that Rabbi Dr. Applebaum, Hashem Yukum Damo, in his term clinics, I think he arranged things that there's non-Jewish doctors on Shabbos, and then on their holidays there's Jewish doctors. So even though a Jew is allowed, I think I heard that he had set up schedules that the Jewish doctors don't have to work on Shabbos, but it would be mutter for them to in his clinics in Terem in Yerushalayim. But did Shmuel really say this? I'm Rabbi Yosef, I'm Rabbi Yehuda, I'm Shmuel. Ein holchem to b'kuach nefesh achar arov. Rabbi Yosef said the name of Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Shmuel. It's the same Shmuel. We don't follow majority when it comes to b'kuach nefesh. Meaning, even if there'd be a small chance that he was Jewish, we would also remove the rubble on Shabbos to try to save him. So how come Shmuel says that because the majority is Jews, we will even be Machal Shabbos to save him? Shmuel himself holds that you would be Machal Shabbos to save someone, even if there's only a small percent chance that he's Jewish. So Elaki Idmar de Shmuel Aresha Idmar. When Shmuel said his statement that we're even Machal Shabbos to save this Jew, this baby that we found, that's only on the first part of the brisa. If the majority are idol worshippers, we assume that this baby that you find is also an idol worshipper. Amar Shmuel says, but in regard to removing the debris, we don't follow this. And even if the majority of the people are non-Jews, we would be Machal Shabbos to save this baby, because maybe he's a Jew. But he didn't say it on, so Shmuel only said his statement on that first din of the Bryce of the Mishnah of the majority were Ovdei Kokavim. But he didn't say it on the second statement of the Mishnah if the majority were Jews. Because even if the majority aren't Jews, Shmuel holds that you would save this life because we don't know who's stuck underneath there, but maybe it's a Jewish life, so we're Machal Shabbos for it. So the Gemara says, Ovdei Kokavim, Oved Kokavim, L'may Hilchasa. So if we say that the majority are Ovdei Kokavim, so we assume this baby is also Ovdei Kokavim, so what's halacha? Anyone who would be trapped in the earthquake, under the rubble, we would do Machal Shabbos. So what does it matter if the majority of the townspeople are Goyim or not, or are Ovdei Kokavim, are pagan idol worshippers or not? We would be Machal Shabbos from anyway. So what the halachic difference does it make if the majority of the city were Ovdei Kokavim? So Amar Papa Lachila Neve'elos. Papa says if we feed him treif, so you're not supposed to. So if someone's a pagan idol worshiper, you're not supposed to give him a gift, even though it's something that we're not allowed to use. Treif meat, we're not allowed to give it to him. But if it's someone, but nowadays there aren't some. I mean, if you go to certain places, they worship. They clearly they worship. What is it called? Pantheism. Many gods. The wind god, the water god. Those are considered. That's considered Ovdei Kokavim. So even though so Muslims are monotheists, Christians, so there are a few monotheistic groups like I think Anglicans and Episcopalians are monotheists or Unitarians. And then in regard to the ones who believe in the Trinity, Jews are certainly not allowed to believe in the Trinity, but to machlokas if non-Jews are allowed to believe in the Trinity. So Christians, even if they're not Unitarians, they're not considered pagans for these halachas. When this Gemara says about covenant, we mean literally pagans who worship the different multiple deities. So if he was an Oved Kochavim, we wouldn't feed him directly food. So then the Gemara asks, if the majority are Jews and he's a Jew, so what halacha are we allowed to do with him by treating him as a Jew? So Rav Papa says to do hashavas aveda. So if a goy loses something, there's no chiyuv of hashavas aveda. If a Jew loses it, there's a chiyuv of hashavas aveda. Now the halacha is if you're going to make a kiddush Hashem, you're supposed to do hashavas aveda to a non-Jew also. There's a story, I forget who was, they bought a camel or a mule, and they found a diamond. It was in a sack on his neck, and I think it was a chumah shatach, whatever. And he said, "Let we have to return it." And they said, "Rabbi, you said we don't have to return a lost item of a non-Jew." He says, "I'll make a kid." So when they returned it, the guy says, "Blessed is the God of Shimon ben Shatach." So I think it was Shimon ben Shatach. So he said, "That's why I did it, so that Hashem would be praised." He made a big kiddush Hashem by returning it. There was a case a few years ago, maybe it's 5 years ago already. Someone had bought a desk, and they found thousands of dollars of cash in the desk. It was a from person. I think maybe it was in Connecticut or somewhere, and they returned it, and it went viral that they returned the money. It was a big kiddush Hashem. So even though mitzad din you may not have to, but if you're going to make a kiddush Hashem, it's not that it's forbidden. Some people think, cheat a goy, that's completely wrong. But Shavas Aveda, you're allowed to return an Aveda of a goy, and if it makes a kiddush Hashem, that makes it all the more worthwhile. So the Gemara says, Mechza Yisrael, if the city is 50-50 goyim and Jews, we treat him like a Jew. So what halacha do we treat him like a Jew that we wouldn't have had otherwise? So Amrei Shlakish Linazikin for damages. So if either he damages or someone damages him, or his ox damages someone, we treat it like a Jew, like the property, the halachas of Nizikin, of damages of a Jew, and not like the damages of a non-Jew. So Hechidami, what exactly do we mean? If our ox, gored his ox, lay I see Raya Yisrael Adushko. So the Jewish person whose ox gored his ox would say, there's halacha motzim mechaber al varaya. You're not allowed to force someone to pay unless you have a proof. So he's saying, unless you can give me proof that you're Jewish, I don't have to pay you, because if you were only a goy, I wouldn't have to pay you. So I'm not going to pay you until you can prove to me that you're Jewish. So lo tzricha danakre tordi day lo tordi done. No. So the case has to be where this baby, who was originally abandoned in the street, and then he grew up, and he had an ox, and his ox gored a Jew's ox, palga mishalem. So if it's an ox that hadn't gored before, the halacha is you pay half damages, because it's a non-natural act for an animal to be so violent to gore. So the halacha is you only pay half of the damage, because you didn't know that you had to guard your shore. It's an unusual behavior for a shore. Nowadays, they would want to say you would have to pay for a pet psychologist. The idach palga, and in regard to the other half, Amar Lahu, he could say, I see Raya Delav Yisrael Anava Etin. If you could prove to me that I'm not a Jew, then I will give it to you. Meaning, because if he would be a goy, he would have to pay the whole thing. And if he's a Jew, he only pays half. So here he could say he pays half because he says he's a Jew. And if they want to say you're a goy, you pay me the whole thing, they say you have to prove that I'm not a Jew. So in that case, we treat him like a Jew in regard to that specific case, and he would pay half just like a Jew. Hajj and Allah Sulanises, we will return to you. Sulanises, the first chapter of Kesuvos, and God willing, next week after Marav, we will start the second chapter. Any questions?